Okay, guys. Sorry about that. Just had to restart everything to make sure everything was up and running. Okay, we're all set now. So let's take a look at the question that we're working on right now, and just jump right in. So the question says, if a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker, then that means A, pressure from competition firms will force acceptance of the prevailing market price. B, it must be a relatively small player compared to its competitors in the overall market. C, it can increase or decrease its output without affecting the overall quantity supplied in the market. Or D, quality differences will be very perceptible and will play a major role in purchaser decision. So, taking a look at this question, we just really are looking at a definition based question, right? Like understanding the theory and the reasoning behind the setup for perfect competition. It's not really going to require us to have much calculation or um, anything applied like that. So we know that perfect competition is one of the kind of theoretical markets that happens in economics. And what we expect to see when we talk about price takers is that no single firm has any influence over what the price is. And so the question is, what is the reasoning behind that? And we know that the reasoning is that if a firm were to try to become a price setter in a perfectly competitive market, what that means is that they would maybe change their price from the equilibrium point, and immediately they would either lose all their business to competition or they would be unable to make a profit. And so that pressure to kind of keep the price at the equilibrium point is what is causing a firm to be a price taker. And so if we're looking at the answer choices, we see that A, which is pressure from competition firms, will force acceptance of the prevailing market price. That's going to be the closest to this idea that we were just talking about. There are some other answers here which are maybe close, but aren't don't quite hit the nail on the head. Answer choice B is it must be a relatively small player compared to its competitors in the overall market. And so I think what this is hinting at is that the firm is not a monopoly because monopolies are price setters. While that is true, it is not necessary that you be small compared to competitors in order for you to be a price taker. There could be simply a large number of firms or competitors, all of this exact same size, in a market where there's thousands or millions of competitors, and that would similarly fulfill the condition of perfect competition and price taking. It's not necessary that this particular firm is actually smaller than the rest. Um, and so, C says it can increase or decrease output without affecting the overall quantity supplied in the market. This is, uh, again, I think hinting at no one firm dominates the market, right? Like if there's only one or two firms, then a single firm which changes its output will affect the aggregate supply of the entire market. But the difference is that because the aggregate supply curve is a sum of all of the firms, it is true that even in perfect competition, any single firm which decreases or increases its output would still have an influence on quantity supplied. It's just a very, very small influence on quantity supplied. Um, and D says quality differences will be very perceptible and play a major role. Again, this is something that doesn't happen in perfect competition. Perfect competition assumes that all products are ubiquitous and identical, and so quality differences make absolutely no difference in perfect competition. And again, even if this has to do with perfect competition, it doesn't have anything to do with a firm being a price taker. So that's not going to be the right choice. So we are going to choose answer choice A, and let's take a look at the previous tutor's solution. So the previous tutor says the market is mainly divided into two types, known as a perfectly competitive market and imperfectly competitive market. That's not. You could divide it that way in that you have perfectly competitive markets, and then you have the rest of the markets. But more aptly, perfect competition is one of several different types of markets, including a monopoly market, a monopolistic competition market, an oligopoly market. So there are a lot of different types of markets actually. So I don't know if it's fair to say there are there's a main division into just two types. So we'll definitely make a note of that as we verify the solution. Let's take a look at what else. So they say the perfectly competitive market is the market structure where a large number of sellers selling similar goods to a large number of buyers. Some grammar issues there, but that is true. Because of the large number of sellers, the contribution of every single firm is less, and so no one has the price setting ability, and so they are a price taker. So we can say that if a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker, then pressure from competition firms will force acceptance of the prevailing market price. Therefore, option A is the correct option. So I think, some of this is good. Some of this could be a little bit more specific. So why don't we try and take a look at this and make it a little bit more accurate. So first, we're not going to do this division into two types. We're going to say the market, perfect competition, perfectly competitive markets are one of several types of market structures. They are characterized by several traits, including a large number of sellers, homogeneous goods, a large number of buyers, and price-taking firms. As a result of So this is the part that might be a bit misleading, because it says because of a large number of sellers, the contribution of every single firm is less, which might hint that C could be the correct answer, and we know that's not the case. So why don't we just break it down by each solution like we did before? So let's say for the first one, when firms are price takers, they are punished for changing the price or deviating the price away from the equilibrium price, because consumers will simply buy their goods from one of the numerous competitors which sell the exact same goods. This means that answer choice A is correct. So B is incorrect because it's not necessary for a price-taking firm to be smaller than its peers, just that there would be many other firms that could be the same size. C says it can, C is incorrect because price-taking firms still affect overall quantity supplied in the market just by a very small amount. And quality D, quality differences are not perceptible in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so that's going to be all of our answer choices broken down for A, B, C, and D. And it's going to be a little bit more well suited towards this question because, we clarify this division into two types, and we also clarify the conditions of perfect competition in case that was useful. And finally, we break down why each answer choice is either right or wrong. So the solution is correct, but we're going to modify that a little bit. So hopefully everybody kind of sees how that worked out. Okay, so let's take a look at the next question. The next question says the two broad sources of potential GDP growth are the growth of blank in the growth of blank, right? So two reasons that GDP might grow. And so, again, this is a very theory-based question. We're not dealing with a lot of, calculations. This is more just like theory and facts. And so, this is something I think you might just have to know. So when we think about potential GDP as the overall output of an economy running at full capacity, meaning that, that is what potential GDP is. In the long run, potential GDP means that all resources are being utilized. There's, everything is variable. It's basically the maximum output of an economy. So when an economy is running at maximum output, what could possibly make that economy grow even further? And so one way you could do it is you could say, well, let's say that everybody's employed, but let's make it so that employed people are more productive than they are now. So they're better able to assemble resources or combine inputs to create output. And that would increase overall GDP. That would be the case, right? Like, again, if we can put this into a microscale, let's say a country only has one factory and the factory has 10 workers. If you say these 10 workers can make one car each a day, and suddenly you double their productivity and they can each make 2 cars a day, then the total potential GDP for this economy has essentially doubled. So that would be an example of how labor productivity growth has led to potential GDP growth. Another example is simply just an increase in the supply of labor, right? And so, or you can also consider that as the increase in overall resources. If a country used to have 5 tons of steel and now it has 10 tons of steel, then that doubling of capital is going to increase the potential GDP or potential output of this economy. Or if you have a more zoomed out scale, a country that used to have only one oil field and then discovers another oil field, then that doubles their output of oil. And so adding more resources as inputs into GDP as production is another way in which we could see potential GDP growth. And so we're going to look for an answer choice that looks for something along those lines. So let's take a look at the answer choices, the solution provided by the tutor. So the tutor said the real growth of the GDP of an economy can be realized with the growth of labor productivity, yeah, and the growth of the supply of labor. So I think it depends on the context of this question. Like if you wanted to talk purely from a labor perspective, then yes. If we talk about capital, then supply of labor would be one form of capital. But I think you can zoom out and say, any type of capital increase would lead to growth in potential GDP. So we'll clarify that in the question. They say here that increases in labor productivity is one of the most important sources of GDP growth. It allows the economy to produce a greater amount of output with the available inputs, effectively increasing the per capita GDP. That's true. That's the definition of increased productivity. And then finally, increase in human capital with the increase in the supply of labor as another determinant which is vital to economic growth. Yeah, so fairly accurate. What we're going to modify is whether or not it's specific to just labor. While growth in the labor supply would definitely increase potential GDP. Outside of the context of labor, we could also say that growth in any type of resource/capital could also increase potential GDP. So if we think about this as increases in capital, so like equipment, increases in natural resources, increases in technology, etc. Right? So all those can also eventually, you can see how those would eventually increase potential GDP of an economy running at full scale. Okay, hopefully this is gonna refresh for us. Yeah, here we go. Alrighty, let's take a look at this question here. This question asks, why is real GDP a more accurate measure of an economy's production than nominal GDP? So again, here we're dealing with this, question of real versus nominal. Real versus nominal. And again, the takeaway is that real numbers account for price change and hold prices constant, and nominal figures don't. And so if that's the case, then we find that real GDP is going to be a more accurate measure than nominal GDP because we know that real GDP measures really only the output of a country and is not influenced by price changes from year to year. Assuming let's talk about GDP growth, assuming that this year, let's say that last year economy produced five goods at $1 each. $1 each, and then this year they produce five goods at $2 each. Nominal GDP, let's do real, nominal. So let's say we use this year one as our base here. Then real GDP would just be 5 times 1 is 5. $5 for year one, and for year two it would be 5 times 1 is still 5. So we'd see no change in GDP from year one to year two. But for nominal, we see year one it would be $5 total nominal GDP, and then year two would be 5 times 2 or $10. And so we would see that production has doubled because of price change, not because the actual number of goods being produced has changed. And so when we're trying to measure production, price is it's just a number, right? It has nothing to do with the actual amount being produced. And so we want to keep it constant, and therefore real, as we can see here, keeps the dollar amount constant in a certain year, and therefore allows us to see changes in real production rather than just changes in price. So we're going to look for an answer choice that tells us about this kind of difference between a change in production versus a change in price. So answer choice A says nominal GDP is adjusted for the effects of inflation or deflation, whereas real GDP is not. And so that flips it. It's real GDP that adjusts for those things and not nominal GDP. The second point says real GDP is not influenced by price changes, but nominal GDP is. And this is true, like we just illustrated on the right. If price changes in the economy, real GDP is not going to be affected by those changes. It's only when production is changed that real GDP has changed. And let's just take a look at 3 for good measure. 3 says real GDP measures the value of the goods and services an economy produces. True. But nominal GDP measures the value of the goods and services an economy consumes. No, so this is more so a difference between the expenditure approach, sort of a consumption approach, versus the production approach to measuring GDP. But that has nothing to do with real versus nominal, so that's not going to be the right answer. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer choices. The tutor says, real GDP is not influenced by price changes, but nominal GDP is, which is correct. And they say the GDP of an economy is an economic indicator that represents the monetary value of all final goods and services produced in an economy during a given period, generally a year within its domestic borders. It is used to indicate the standard of living in an economy and the economic capacity so as to compare two economies. And so that's true. I don't think it's necessary to answer this question, but it's good background. Nominal GDP is the value of the GDP measured in terms of the prevailing prices, which is today's prices, and hence it does not account for changes in price that have occurred over time. Yes, that is correct. When the effects of price changes are taken into consideration and a nominal GDP is adjusted for inflation or deflation, then we get the real GDP. This is good. This is a good explanation. Finally, real GDP is a more accurate measure of an economy's production, as we can't conclude if the increase in a nominal GDP has occurred due to an increase in output or due to an increase in prices, whereas an increase in real GDP always shows an increase in economy's output. Yeah, I honestly don't think I could have said it better myself. So this is a really great answer, and we're going to say great answer, very thorough. And we can mark that correct. Nothing really to modify with that. Okay, let's take a look at this next question. And let me just erase all this. The most common economic system in the world is a blank. And so we have a closed economy, a command economy, a mixed economy, or a traditional economy. This is again more of a definition and fact-based question, not really calculation-based. I'm not really going to add any numbers here. So let's take a look at each of these answer choices and see if we come to our answer. So again, I think there's two ways we could approach this. You could just know which the fact of which one of these is the most common economic system. That's possible, but we can also use the process of elimination and take a look at some of these answer choices and see if we can't narrow it down a little bit. So a closed economy, which is answer choice A, refers to a economy where there is no like trade with the outside world. And so if there's no trade, we would call an economy closed. And so you would only be interacting with domestic resources. And so we deal with these closed economies in theory, in economics, but in the real world, I don't think we're very hard pressed to find a single example of a genuine closed economy, right? Because today globalization, economies and countries have to trade with each other in order to be viable countries, right? So we don't really see closed economies in the world. So it's not going to be A. B says a command economy, and a command economy talks about like having the basically a central power or a central government kind of determining exactly where production goes and where resources are allocated and who they should go to. Again, we've seen these in theory. I think the closest thing historically comes to like maybe like the Soviet Union, or like communism with like Marx, where like the government decides where everybody works and who gets what. But again, we are very hard pressed to find a true command economy in the world. Maybe like North Korea, but like that's pretty hard to have a central body controlling almost all aspects of the economy. That's pretty hard to do, and we don't really see that in the real world. So we don't think it would be B as well. C is a mixed economy. So you would ask, what is it mixed between? So it's basically mixed between a command economy and a free market economy, a market economy. Market economy is not listed here, but is what we think of when we talk about basically like capitalism, having a free market, interaction of supply and demand, all those things where like the market settles into its own equilibrium. Those are all market economy concepts. And then mix that with command economy, you get like certain services are publicly provided rather than privately provided. And so this is going to be similar to what a lot of countries have. We can just take the United States, for example, having kind of private markets for insurance, private markets for cars, any real good private good that you can think of, and then we have government providing things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Government will regulate the military, certain public goods like national parks, and so all those things together are going to tell us that mixed economies are very feasible and are maybe favorable in certain market kind of viewpoints. And we know that a lot of countries are going to have characteristics of mixed economies throughout the world. So C seems to be a really good answer. D says traditional economy. I'm actually not really sure which one of which this is referring to. I think it might be one of the more theoretical supply and demand economies. Um, but why don't we Google this real quick? So traditional economy. Oh, right, right. So basically, an economy that doesn't run off of like market or like central authority, but basically is guided by customs, as we see here, customs, history, and time-honored beliefs. So we see these in a lot of developing markets, but again, this is not going to be the most common system in the world. So to put this all together, we're going to say C is the right answer, mixed economy, and so we can take a look at some of what the question has said, the previous tutor has said. The economic system is divided into many types of economic systems, like closed economy, command economy, traditional economy, etc. The mixed market economy is the most common economic system in the world. It is because of the features of this market structure, which include the features of both capitalism and socialism. Uh, so these are not the technical terms. Like technically, we were talking about market economy and a command economy being blended rather than capitalism and socialism. So we'll clarify that. So we'll see what else the tutor says. The main reason for saying that is the market work as a free market with some level of state intervention. I think there must be a typo there. It is a mix of two economic systems, and so most of the countries follow this system, which makes it the most common system. Therefore, option C is the correct option. So we can clarify some of this. Well, first of all, we can say a mixed economy is a blend between market economy and a command economy. And this is the most common market or economic system because it addresses a lot of the fundamental problems with either one of these economies. For example, market economies don't provide public goods, and command economies reduce incentive to work. And so a blend of these two is going to basically account for the flaws in each system, right? A market economy doesn't provide public goods, but a command economy would provide public goods by mandating resources be spent there. So if we have both aspects, that would be fixed. A command economies reduce incentive to work. If you can think of the government the government decides where resources are allocated and provides for people, and then there's no incentive to work harder to basically stand out or make profit because your profit would just be taken by the command economy, right? So if you blend the two, then you would address both these problems and you would find the optimal kind of economy. And that's why a lot of countries have adopted this system. So this is correct. Okay, so the next question says, what does increasing marginal opportunity costs mean? So increasing marginal opportunity costs refers to a situation in which you're making trade-offs between goods. We can think about this in terms of the two-good model that we kind of often use when talking about the production possibilities frontier. So it's going to look like this. You have like good X and good Y, and quantity of both on each axis, right? So the increase in marginal opportunity costs is actually the reason why we see that the PPF, production possibilities frontier, is bowed outward instead of a straight line here, right? Why is there not, if we had constant marginal opportunity costs, aka trade-offs, then we know that for every unit of X we produce, we give up a constant amount of Y. The reason it's bowed out is because the amount of Y that you give up for each unit of production is going to go up as you continue to produce. So basically, in terms of what it means, it basically is pretty self-explanatory. It means that marginal opportunity cost increases as you continue to produce a good. I think the best way to do this is visualize here. So let's take a couple units of X as an example, right? So let's do 5 units of X. Let's say that 5 units of X, the maximum amount of units of X you could produce if you use all your resources there. So we know that when we're producing, we don't need to do that here. When we're producing at, X is equal to 1, we give up, if we go from 0 to 1, we give up in this poorly drawn graph that I've made, we give up no Y, right? We give up a very small amount of Y, right? We go from this point here, let's see if I can change it to color. We go from this point here to this point here. Basically a marginal drop, right? Very low marginal, low trade-off. And that means that the opportunity cost is low, right? The opportunity cost of additional unit of X is going to be a drop in the production of Y. And so a drop in the production of Y here is marginal. And so we start off when producing X having very low opportunity cost. Let's say if we put a value to it, opportunity cost at X equals 1 is 0, right? I don't know why I drew it this way. X, production, and opportunity cost. So if X equals 1, opportunity cost is like 0.01, right? Very low. Okay, so let's go from 1 to 2. If you go from 1 to 2, now we see there's a slight drop, right? We go from this point to this point. There's going to be a little drop in production, right, from here to here. And we're going to say from X1 to 2, we have an opportunity cost of, 1, right? So producing one additional unit of X causes opportunity cost here to drop by 1 unit. Okay, so what happens if we go to 3? So we can see here that there's already a trend of marginal opportunity cost increasing. We go from 2 to 3, we're going to get a point right here. Draw a little bit bigger, and we see this gap is starting to get bigger. See this gap is starting to get bigger and bigger. We'll call that 2. Go to 4. Big gap, big drop. We'll call that 3. And at 5, we suddenly see, we're at 0, right? So let's say I got 5. For some reason, the way I've drawn this, the opportunity cost is like 15, right? And so we can see here that as production of X has gone from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, the marginal opportunity cost has gone from 0.01 to 1 to 2 to 3 to like 15, right? So marginal opportunity cost has increased over time. And as a result, we have this bowed outward opportunity cost, or sorry, production possibilities frontier. And that illustrates increasing opportunity costs, that as production goes up, we give up more and more of the other good. Okay. The question then is why is that the case? Why do we see increasing marginal opportunity costs? And the reason for this, or one really big reason, and the way I like to think about it, is that not all resources are created equal, right? Let's say that good X refers to wheat, and good Y refers to cars. So if I'm this country that has 2 goods that I can produce, I can either produce cars or wheat, and then I have a bunch of resources. I have some steel, I have some dirt, I have some seeds, I have some hose, I have some wheels, and I can choose to utilize my resources to produce either good. So obviously, steel is going to be more well suited to producing cars than wheat, whereas dirt is going to be more suited to producing wheat than cars. So if we see that we're at either extreme, let's say I use all my resources. I'm trying to produce all wheat. That means I'm using my steel, I'm using my wheels, I'm using my engine blocks to all produce wheat, even though those things would be better used to produce cars. And so let's say I want to start to lower my production of wheat from 5 to 4. Um, what I'm going to see is that my production drop from cars is going to be relatively little, right? You know, that's because a lot of the resources I'm taking away to start producing cars with are resources that are better uh, suited to producing cars anyways. Like, taking away wheels from my wheat production is not going to decrease my wheat production by that much, but it could really jumpstart my production of cars. And so that's one main reason that we're going to see this increase in marginal opportunity costs. Because as we continue to allocate resources and take them away from wheat and put them to cars, that's where you're going to start seeing these trade-offs where you have, uh, a lot of problems with now you're cutting into wheat production by taking away the wheat oriented resources and putting them towards cars instead. And so that is going to be more of the issue when we come to that. So that's going to illustrate kind of the rationale why increasing marginal opportunity cost occurs. So now that we have that all set down, why don't we take a look at what the previous tutor has said. So previous tutor said the increasing marginal opportunity cost is an economic principle that helps the business come up with financially prudent decisions. The marginal opportunity cost is the cost of a business incurs after it produces additional products. They may have to buy additional raw materials and equipment and hire new employees to produce and sell the said product. It also factors in what the business stands to lose if it will keep on producing the same products instead of producing an entirely different product that can attract the interest of a new customer. The marginal opportunity cost takes all of these into consideration, so a business can make better decisions when it comes to maximizing profits. Uh, so I think this answer choice is too business oriented. Uh, Normally when we talk about increasing marginal opportunity costs, we are talking about the PPF. So I'm just going to supplement this answer by including an explanation of the relationship between increasing marginal opportunity costs and the two good model. So why don't we just type that up right here? So we say increasing marginal opportunity costs is often discussed in relation to the two good model and the production possibilities frontier. The this It refers to the idea that a as a firm slash country decides to produce additional units of good X, uh, good X and Y. We introduced that earlier. So as a firm or country decides to produce additional units of good X, it must give up more and more units of good Y as opportunity cost. This relationship explains why the PPF is outwardly bowed rather than a straight line. And then we're going to go in the rationale. The reason the marginal opportunity or costs increase is because certain resources are better suited to production of good X rather than good Y, or vice versa. As you produce good X towards one of the extremes, resources end up being used inefficiently. Let's see what the So we're not going to this. Okay. And so let's take a look at our final answer. We said that increasing marginal opportunity cost is often discussed in relation to the two good model, goods X and Y, and the reduction possibilities frontier, PPF. The first idea that as a firm or country decides to produce additional units of good X, it must give up more and more units of good Y as opportunity costs. This relationship explains why the PPF is outwardly bad rather than a straight line. The reason marginal opportunity cost increases is because certain resources are better suited to the production of good X rather than good Y, or vice versa. As you produce good X towards one of the extremes, resources end up being used inefficiently. And then say, moving away from this inefficiency causes the opportunity cost to be greater. Okay. As resources are moved away from their efficient use. Okay. And then we're going to say that's correct. All right. Let's take a look at the next. Next question. It says, explain why the price elasticity of demand is generally a negative number, except in the cases where the demand curve is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. What would be implied by a positive price elasticity of demand? So again, for this question, we are going to have to know one of the main equations, and that's price elasticity of demand. And so what that refers to is going to be the idea that if equation is given by change in quantity or percentage change in quantity. What does that change in quantity? Change in quantity over change in price. So how does a change in price impact quantity demanded? And so why is the price elasticity of demand generally a negative number? And we're going to address that first. It's because price changes and quantity changes almost always for demand are going to operate in opposite directions. If price goes up, the law of demand tells us that quantity demand is going to go down. And if price goes down, the law of demand tells us that quantity demanded goes up, right? The law of demand is how demand curves work. And so if price goes up, that means the change in price has to be positive and the quantity change has to be negative. So a negative divided by a positive number is going to equal a negative number, right? Price decreases means that the change in price is going to be negative. Quantity increases means the change in quantity is going to be positive. Therefore, we're going to have a positive over a negative number, and that's going to give us a negative number. So in almost all scenarios, we see that the relationship holds that price elasticity is going to be negative. And that's because of the law of demand. So we call this law of demand. So then it gives us some exceptions, except in the cases where the demand curve is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. So if we have perfectly elastic, we're going to have a curve like that. We're going to have perfectly inelastic. We're going to have a curve like this, right? So, sorry, I'm not sure why this is right there. Okay, so why is that the case? Well, we know that when we have a perfectly inelastic curve, no matter what happens, there's going to be no change in price, basically. Price never changes. So price change is always equal to 0. And that means that inelasticity is always going to be undefined here. Elasticity equal to something divided by 0, which is equal to does not exist. And then perfectly inelastically, we see that the change in quantity is always going to be equal to 0, right? There's only one quantity being produced. The quantity of demand is constant, is at all times, no matter what the price is. So we're going to get elasticity of demand is equal to 0 divided by something, and that's going to give us 0. And so in these cases, elasticity is neither positive or negative. One is does not exist, and zero is not negative. And so those are the exceptions that we see. And so again, this law of demand explains why most of the time we find a negative, and then the specific calculations in the unique circumstances of perfect elasticity or perfect inelasticity are going to cause us to understand the rationale for why it's not necessarily always negative. Finally, what will be implied by positive price elasticity of demand? Positive price elasticity of demand would imply that the law of demand is broken, right? That as a price goes up, you would see quantity demanded go up, or that as price goes down, we see quantity demanded go down. One thing that we can see here is if price goes up and quantity demanded goes up, this is what we might think of as a luxury good, right? The idea that a high price indicates, value or prestige or recognition. And so actually, by increasing the price of something, you make people want it even more. However, in real life, this only holds for maybe a little bit of the spectrum. At the end of the day, if you increase price by too much, the quantity demand has to go down. Another way that you might have a positive price elasticity demand is if price decreases and then quantity demanded decreases. And again, I don't think there's any version of this where that's true. I'm trying to think, but I don't think that's true. And so, right. So we wouldn't see that being the case here. So that would be basically the implication of a positive price elasticity demand is that you find a good where the law of demand does not apply, which is not the case for any good. So let's take a look at what the answer provided by the previous tutor says. So the previous answer says, price elasticities are almost always negative, although analysts tend to ignore the sign, even though this can lead to ambiguity. That's true. Normally, when we talk about elasticity, we use absolute value signs. So it's going to look like something like that. So absolute value would make it positive. That's just something to keep in mind. That's sometimes the notation. Only goods which do not conform to a law of demand, such as Veblen or Giffen goods. Oh, Giffen goods, right? That's what it was called. Great on this tutor for remembering. Have positive PAD. Yeah, so that is true. Veblen and Giffen goods are the names of the two goods that would fulfill these two conditions, where either there's an increase in price that allows quantity to go up as well, or a decrease in price which allows quantity to go down as well. So great answer. In general, the demand for a good is said to be inelastic or relatively inelastic when the price elasticity is less than 1 in absolute value. That's true. Not necessary to answer this question, but good knowledge. And that means that changes in price have a relatively small effect on the quantity of the good demanded. The demand for a good is said to be elastic or relatively elastic when its price elasticity is greater than 1. That is, changes in price have a relatively large effect on the quantity of the good demanded. That's true. That's just the definition of quantity. The equation. I think the one thing that this answer choice doesn't do very well is that explaining why the price elasticity of demand is generally a negative number. They do mention the law of demand, but don't necessarily do this breakdown that we do here. So we're just going to do that and make this answer choice just a little bit better. So let's take a look. So we say the law of demand tells us that as price increases, as a goods price increases, the quantity demanded decreases, and vice versa. Price elasticity of demand. So we can say, in other words, price and quantity always always change in opposite directions. Price elasticity demand is given by the formula percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. And so as a result, for the majority of goods which fulfill the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity means that the elasticity of demand will be negative, regardless of the direction of change. Yeah. Price elasticity. So let's take a look just to make sure we got it all right. Law of demand tells us that as a goods price increases, the quantity of demand decreases and vice versa. In other words, price and quantity always change in opposite directions. Price elasticity of demand is given by the formula percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. As a result, for the majority of goods which fulfill the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity means that price elasticity of demand will be negative regardless of the direction of change. So that's going to kind of, fill in a little bit of the gap in this answer choice. But other than that, this answer choice does a great job of answering the question. Let's take a look at the next question. So the next question says, when the Fed adjusts its interest rate, it directly influences consumer what? And so interest rate set by the Fed, it basically regulates the rate at which you borrow money. And so you can think of borrow or lend money. And so those two are just the two sides of the same coin. And we're basically going to be looking for an answer choice that tells us about that borrowing nature. So directionally, we would say that if the Fed adjusts its interest rate and it increases the interest rate, then the consumers will borrow less. If you think about borrowing for investment, an increase in interest rate essentially makes a loan, quote unquote, more expensive, right? Let's say you borrow $1,000 at, interest rate of 10%. That means after 1 year, you would owe $1,010 on your repayment of that loan plus interest, right? You repay $1,000, 10% of $1,000 after a year is $10. You get, $100. Let me see if I can. You owe $100 on that $1,000 loan. Well, let's say interest rate gets increased to 20%. 20%. Same loan, $1,000 becomes $1,200 that you have to repay. So as the interest rate goes up, the loan repayment becomes more expensive, and that makes it less attractive. And so that increased interest rate makes loans more expensive, makes it less attractive, means consumers are going to borrow less. And we can similarly say that as we reverse the trend, let's say it used to be a 20% interest rate, and now we reduce it to 10%, then loans become cheaper. A loan of $1,000 used to cost you $1,200 for a year, and now it costs you only $1,100 a year. And so that's going to be another way of thinking about the direction of the relationship. But we know that regardless, when there's a change in the interest rate, when the Fed changes the interest rate, that's going to cause there to be a direct influence on the consumer. So let's take a look at the loans, sorry, not the loans, the answer choice provided by the first tutor. So they say borrowing, which is correct. And they say decreasing the interest rate leads to a reduction in the cost of borrowing for the consumers, which consequently incentivizes borrowing and investment for the businesses. So exactly, so that's what we were talking about on the latter half of our explanation. They say similarly, an increase in interest rate by the Federal Reserve increases the cost of borrowing, which adversely affects loan demand. Yeah, that's exactly right. So adjustments of interest rate by the Federal Reserve directly influence consumer borrowing. The interest rate also affects the bond market, as lower interest rate makes bonds less attractive to new investors, causing stock market rallies, whereas high interest rate makes the market attractive. Yeah, that's true. Um, that's not necessarily the relationship that they're talking about in this question, but this is the relationship in terms of more of the finance type of market uh, that we're talking about. So we're going to say great solution. Uh, Great solution. Very, very clear. And that is going to be correct. So the next question says, when does the government regulate producers in a mixed market economy? Again, so when we talk about mixed market, what are we talking about a mix? It's a mix between a command economy and a market economy. And so government is going to participate in certain areas of the economy. Normally, the market is going to control the majority of the economy, interaction of supply and demand. And we see that the government is going to regulate producers as needed. And as needed refers to areas where there might be market failures. And so market failures refer to places where a full market economy would not be able to functionally operate the most efficiently. We can think of externalities as a market failure, public goods, monopolistic competition, monopoly markets, tragedy of the commons. All these are examples of places where if you were to leave the market up to the interaction of supply and demand, you would not have the optimal solution at the end of the day. And that's where government steps in mixed markets in order to regulate. So let's take the example of externalities. Producers might overproduce because they are not accounting for the negative externality of pollution, and government is going to come in and regulate those producers in order to make sure that the producers internalize the cost of pollution either through cap and trade or through taxes or penalties. And that is example of that government regulation of producers on an as needed basis. If producers in a market didn't have externalities and there were no market failures, and it's a perfectly okay market for private economy to take over, then the government would have no need to intervene. And we know that any government intervention in one of those markets with no market failures is going to actually cause it to be inefficient. So we would say on an as needed basis, the government will regulate producers in a mixed market economy. Okay, so let's take a look at the previous answer. So the previous answer says as needed, which is correct. It says a mixed market economic system is a mix between a command economy and a market economy. This means an economic system under which the government participates in making economic decisions and allows individual consumers and firms to participate in making economic decisions as well. In the mixed market economy, private sectors are free to choose the type of businesses they want to pursue, but the government would make an intervention. The government is convinced that some private industries are working against the interest of the society, i.e. social interests. Thus, there will only be government intervention where it is needed to strike an ideal balance between self-interest and social interest, social justice. So this, I think, is more talking about the difference between efficiency and equity. If we can think about social justice in the idea that resources should be divided equitably rather than efficiently, I think that would be more apt. And I think that is one way in which government will intervene. You can think about social safety nets like Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. Those are all going to be more about equity than efficiency. But I will say I think this solution does miss what we talked about earlier, which is that interaction of the government in market failures. So we can say that government should also government would also intervene in situations in where there are market failures. These might include externalities, monopolies, public goods, etc. A market economy would inefficiently allocate resources when dealing with market failures, which would require intervention by or regulation by the government. And that's going to be more of our filled in answer. So government would also intervene in situations where there are market failures. These might include externalities, monopolies, public goods, etc. A market economy would inefficiently allocate resources when dealing with market failures, thus requiring intervention or regulation by the government. And that's going to be a correct solution. Great, so let's take a look at this one here. So this looks like to be a long one. Let's take a look at the different questions we are dealing with here. So we say, number one, assume the following data for a country. Total population is equal to 500, population under 16 of age or institutionalized of 120, not in the labor force is 150, unemployed is 23, part-time workers for full-time jobs, looking for full-time jobs is 10. What is the size of the labor force? So let's take a look at this. Labor force is going to be the number of people who are both able to have a job and have been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. If we put the information here together, though, we know that those in the labor force added to those not in the labor force is equal to the total population. And here we have the total population in the total population of people not in the labor force. So we could actually just do 500, oops, one more time. Let's see if we can get this pen to work. Can't get the pen to work for some reason. Give me 1 second, guys. There we go. There we go. Okay, 500, oh my. Yeah, 500 minus 150, that's going to give us 350, right? That's going to be our total labor force. And what is the unemployment rate? We know it's the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. That's going to be 23 divided by 350, and that's going to give us, let's see, 23 divided by 350, and it's going to give us 6.57%. We're going to multiply this by 100. Okay, and that's going to be how we calculate that. So next, take a look at the next question. If the CPI was 110 last year and is 121 this year, what is the year rate of yearly, I want to say yearly rate of inflation? In contrast, suppose that CPI last year and what was 110 and 108 this year, what is this year's rate of inflation? What term do economics use to describe the second outcome? So we're going to use the CPI figures to calculate the rate of inflation. We know that inflation is going to be given by change in CPI divided by change in time. So if last year's CPI, or sorry, wait, change in CPI divided by CPI in year one, right? I think that is more likely. Yeah, so we're going to take a look at the first example, which is 121 minus 110. We have year 2 CPI minus year 1 CPI divided by year 1 CPI of 110. The rate of inflation then is going to be equal to 11 divided by 110, or 10%, right? For year 2, we had 108 minus 110 divided by 110. That's going to be equal to -2 divided by 110. So that would be negative 1.8%. And that is going to be referred to in economics as deflation, right? Price levels are actually going down based on these two CPIs. And so that's going to be our interaction for those questions. Let's take a look at this third question. Use the hypothetical economy data in the table below to answer the following questions. So we have amount demanded on the left, we have price level or price index in the middle, and we have amount of real GDP supplied in billions here. So we know these are both real GDP numbers, so it's separate from price. So let's take a look at A. What is the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium level of output in this hypothetical economy? Use Excel to graph both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. Can there be equilibrium level of output at below full employment? So a lot of questions going on here. So I'm not going to bring out Excel to graph this, but we would see that if we were to graph both of these answer choices, both of these curves, we would see that they would intersect at one point, which is right here, where the amount of real GDP demanded is 300 billion. The amount of real GDP supplied is in 300 billion as well. So that is the equilibrium price level in output. So it would be equilibrium price, it would be 200 and 300 billion. Can there be equilibrium level of output at below full employment? So I think this is not sure where this question is going with that. Below full employment, employment is going to be not directly related to GDP. And so it's definitely possible to be at the equilibrium level of output below a full employment if we're not assuming a long run equilibrium. At long run equilibrium, we would assume full employment. So because we don't know the time frame, we're not going to know the answer to that. B says, at which price level will aggregate supply fall below or equal aggregate demand? So what I'm it's talking about fall below. At price level 150, the aggregate supply is 200, which is less than aggregate supply of 420. So we're going to say, really any price less than 200. If price is less than 200, then that's going to fulfill that condition. And at what price level will demand fall below aggregate supply? So basically, if there's a surplus, and we see that at any level in which price is greater than 200, you would have a surplus. And at what, if given the price level of 250, will aggregate demand exceed supply? And the answer is no, because you would have a surplus, not a deficit, and you would have a surplus, not a shortage, and you would have a surplus of like 140. And so that's not going to be right either. If the aggregate demand schedule shifted by $140 billion to the right at every level, what would the new equilibrium level of income be? It's basically saying that at every price level, you increase aggregate demand by another 140 billion. And so then we would find, so instead of 180 here, you would have 2 or 320, which is not equal 500. Here you have 400, which would equal 400. So the new equilibrium would be 250 price and then 400 billion in output. And that would be your answer there. So let's take a look at what the answer choice given by the previous tutor said. So we have total population is 500, population under 120 is 16 years of age, not in the labor force is 150, unemployed is 23, part-time is 10. It's the size of the labor force. They said 500 minus 120 minus 150 over 230 equals to 230. So I see here, what we did is I kind of assumed that total population meant total adult population, which is not the case and was a bad assumption. So this is indeed correct. We want to do 500 minus 120 as well, because the labor force plus those not in the labor force added together would equal the total adult population, but the adult population is actually 500 minus 120 and not 500. So that's my bad. 230 is right, so ignore what I did here. Unemployment rate would then be, instead of over 350, it would be over 230, so you would get 10% instead of 6.5, which is a much cleaner number as well. And so I think that basically covers the rest. And I don't think this tutor actually answered the other parts of the question. And so we're going to go ahead and fill that in, I guess. So we're going to have to do question 2. So in question 2, we have inflation is equal to CPI, or CPI year 2 minus CPI year 1. We have to divide that by CPI year 1. That means for this one, it would be 120. So 121 minus 110 divided by 110 is equal to 10%. And then 108 minus 110 divided by 110 is equal to negative 1.8%. And this is referred to as deflation because price levels are decreasing over time. And then that's going to answer all of the parts of question 2. And then question 3, we're going to talk about, part A. So 3A tells us equilibrium price and output can be found where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. That occurs at price equals 200 and output equals 300 billion. So then we want to do part B. Part B says, at what price level will aggregate supply fall below aggregate demand, and which one will aggregate demand fall below aggregate supply? So price, aggregate demand, aggregate supply is going to be less than aggregate demand if price is less than 200. Aggregate supply is going to be greater than aggregate demand if price is greater than 200. If given a price level of 250, given a price level of 250, demand will not be greater than supply because price is greater than 200. And finally, answer choice C, rightward shift in demand by 140 billion means that that aggregate demand is 140 billion greater at every price level, i.e. add 140 to each number in the demand column. We can again find the equilibrium by setting aggregate demand equals aggregate supply after this shift. The new equilibrium is at price equals 250 and output equals 400 billion. And that will be our final answer. Let's take a look at this question one more time to make sure we've answered all the parts. So we have question 1 is correct. Question 2 says inflation is given by this equation. That gives us these two figures. And this figure of a decreasing cost CPI over time is referred to as deflation. Question 3 says find the equilibrium. We can find that by saying where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. That's at this point. Aggregate supply is less than aggregate demand if price is less than 200. Aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand if price is greater than 200. Given the price level of 250, demand will not be greater than supply because price is greater than 200. And finally, a rightward shift causes us to increase each demand figure by 140 on the left. And that's going to give us some new figures to find a new equilibrium, which is at 250 and 400 billion. So I'm going to mark the solution incorrect just because it was, not complete. And hopefully that modification that we made is going to make it so that this answer choice is a lot more helpful to those who want it. Okay. The next question says, the lack of competition within a monopoly means that, number 1, offered goods and services are lackluster. Let's just take a look at the rest of the answer choices. Number 2, monopolists set their own prices. Number 3, the products market is small. And number 4, consumers must look elsewhere to find options. So let's take a look at each of these and see if we can eliminate these. So offered goods and services are lackluster. That's not necessarily true. There's an argument that says that competition increases the quality of goods because people want to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And if you have a monopoly with no competitors, then maybe the quality of goods might go down, but this is not necessarily the case. There are probably many examples of monopoly having quality goods. And so we're not going to pick or number 1 as the answer choice for this one necessarily. Number 2 says monopolists set their own prices. And this is true because, in perfect competition, we assume that there's high competition, which means that all firms are price takers. In monopolies, we assume that because there's no competition, firms are actually price setters. They can vary their output to change the price that they want to set. And that's a tool that monopolists have that perfectly competitive firms don't. So that is definitely one of their advantages or one of their tools. The third is that the products market is small. That's not necessarily true. There are a lot of examples of natural monopolies which are very large. We can think of like the electric grid market or cell phone service. Those product markets are huge, and yet they are also monopolies. And so that is not necessarily going to be the case that the products market is small. And finally, consumers must look elsewhere to find options. Again, lacking competition does not mean that you have to find other options. A lot of times, natural monopolies exist in places in which there are no other options, and we can think again about cell phone carriers where you may only have 1 or 2 providers in a certain area, or electric grid where you don't really get to say who services your electricity in your area. It's kind of preset and predetermined by natural monopolies. And so consumers can't look for other options in those circumstances. So we're going to say option 2, monopolists set their own prices, is most likely going to be the right answer. And so let's take a look at the answer choices given by, or the rationale given by the previous tutor. Previous tutor says, yes, monopolists set their own prices. And they say a monopoly is a market type defined by the existence of a single producing agent. The sole producer and supplier controls the entire market supply and enjoys the fruit of its market control. It exercises immense bargaining power over its consumers as they do not have alternatives to switch to. A monopoly is characterized by the existence of absolute barriers to entry and exit and the inexistence of substitutes. It doesn't have to have absolute barriers to entry, just very high barriers to entry. But we'll let that slide. Hence, a monopolist is enabled to charge a price of its own. As the monopolist applies to the entire market, it faces the market demand curve as its individual demand curve. The monopolist sets its own price at a point on its demand curve, i.e., the average revenue corresponding to the intersection of the marginal revenue and the marginal cost curve, i.e., the profit maximizing point. So I think this gives a really good breakdown of what a monopoly is, and also what a specific monopoly graph looks like, which is good. And yeah, so that freedom offered by the lack of competition allows monopolies to do all these things. So I think this is pretty good. I'll say not necessary to have absolute barriers, just very high barriers. Otherwise, good summary. And let's take a look at the next question. This question says, globalization leads to more trade between which one of these parties? Consumers, countries, factories, or businesses? So globalization refers to the idea that the world is more interconnected these days, and countries are going to have to work together to be more open to trade, and trade again is going to benefit everybody. So let's again define globalization real quickly. We see globalization here is the processes by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. And so we're, for this one, I'm going to be inclined to say it's either countries or businesses. I think that there's definitely a case to be made for both answer choices. If we think about countries, this is the definition of the difference between a closed and open economy, where countries are now more free to trade with others, and so I think globalization definitely increases trade among countries, and it also similarly increases trade among businesses because businesses are open to more global markets, and they can also open more global supply chains. I don't think globalization is necessarily going to lead to trade between consumers. I think consumers benefit from globalization in the form of lower prices, but it may be new products, but they are not going to be the ones who engage in trade by, finding international sellers and doing that. Although I guess some people probably do that, so maybe you could make an argument for consumers as well. But factories factories don't really engage in trade, so I don't think that's a very good answer choice. But I think countries and businesses both trade more as a result of globalization. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said and see if they made a more clear differentiation, because I think this is just a kind of a trickier, poorly written question. So the previous tutor said businesses, and so let's see the justification for that. So globalization refers to the coming together of economic entities, the integration of national and local economic players into a global market to support an increased level of interaction between them and emerge as a singular, unregulated market unit with standardized products and processes. Firms from different industries globalize to exploit the benefits of different markets, expand their functional trade area, and subsequently earn greater profits. So that's true. Globalization allows every firm to explore its comparative advantage and specialize to trade the surplus with global consumers to earn higher profits. It opens up new avenues for production input and processes outsourcing. It leads to an increased level of exports and imports. The consumer base for firms increase, and the availability of goods and services gets enhanced. So again, yeah, there's definitely benefits that you know businesses get in terms of globalization being a beneficial thing. But again, I think this solution misses the fact that countries can also will also trade more as a result of globalization, due to the same, due to the same mechanisms mentioned above. Countries on a global scale, countries can specialize in production, and that they have a comparative advantage in and trade for other products. This question seems to have multiple correct answers, although I do think that countries are more. I think countries would be the more apt answer if I had to pick one. So we're going to say incorrect, just because I think countries is a little bit more accurate in terms of that. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. Tariffs and subsidies are both examples of restrictions, economic benefits, economic penalties, or incentives. So let's go over what a tariff and subsidy is. A tariff is a tax that you impose on goods that are being imported from other countries or internationally. And so that's going to be, a tool to help protect domestic producers and also, raise the price of imports. Subsidies, on the other hand, are given to people to basically stimulate or incentivize behavior that the government wants more of. And so that can be either domestic or international, basically lowering the cost of production for certain goods. So let's take a look at the answer choices. Restrictions. So tariffs are not a firm restriction. They're going to decrease the amount that you import for sure, but they're not saying that you can't import. A restriction would be more akin to a quota, where you say, we're going to allow 1 million tons of steel to be imported, and that's it. And that's a quota, and that's a cap, and that's a restriction. A tariff is not going to be one of those. It's more of a tax. I would say it's an incentive. It's not a benefit or a penalty necessarily. You can think of it maybe as a penalty for importing, but that's not going to be the same case for subsidies. And we know that subsidies are benefits, so they can't both be benefits and penalties. And then subsidies don't restrict behavior at all. They are not saying you can't do anything. In fact, they're saying we want you to do more of this, and so that's an incentive. So we can think of both tariffs and subsidies as different forms of incentives for certain behavior that the government might want to stimulate. Take a look at the answer choices provided by the previous tutor. The previous tutor says incentives as well, which is good. And they say tariffs are an instrument of protectionism imposed by the state on imports to protect the interests of domestic producers and suppliers and to reduce the intensity of competition from foreign players. Again, yes, very true. That's why you would implement a tariff in most situations. Subsidies, on the other hand, are monetary provisions granted by the states to support a particular economic activity or sector. That is a subsidy. Both are economic incentives provided to protect or enhance the welfare of a set of market agents. Both are economic incentives. You're basically trying to motivate certain behavior. When an economy is open to international trade, competition in a global environment pitches domestic players against foreign players, reducing prices in the domestic market and harming their producer surplus. Now, that's not always the case, right? Like, it's only in certain industries where a certain industry's equilibrium domestic price is maybe higher the world price. That's where you're going to have this situation where producers are being harmed. So tariffs are employed on imports by the government that increases imports prices and subsequently domestic supply. Right. So subsidies are either provided to manufacturers or suppliers to support the production of certain goods or services of vital importance to society, but of low profitability, or for pollution abatements to reduce externality from the market, or are given to buyers to support the demand for certain goods and services, especially those that are crucial to life but do not fall in everyone's affordable bracket. Again, yeah. So these are I think there's a variety of there's a variety of reasons in which you would implement a subsidy. Tariffs is pretty one single sided. Like you would be doing it to, protect producers in the domestic economy, and again, maybe also protect national security interest in certain areas, but or maybe punish other countries. But why don't we clarify the one thing I wanted to say, which is competition in the global market only hurts domestic producers if domestic prices are greater than equilibrium prices. If, on the other hand, domestic prices are less than equilibrium prices, then the industry would become an exporter and would actually benefit from global trade. This let's say point of clarification. Tariffs would thus only be used in scenarios where domestic prices are less than equilibrium prices. And there's a whole graph and system to understand exactly what happens when you have the interaction between a domestic economy and a global economy, and if an economy becomes an exporter versus an importer, that is something you can visualize on the graph, and that's something that if your class goes a lot into that, that's important to understand as well. But this is mostly correct. We're going to say it's mostly correct, and so we're going to move on to the next question with our little modification. Okay, so the next question says, what is the main goal in creating the federal budget? And so again, we just ask ourselves, what is the federal budget? There's a whole process by which government goes through in order to make what is called the federal budget, which is basically an allocation of wherever government will be spending money in the next fiscal year. And it starts with the president making a proposal, it goes to Congress, Congress has to approve it, and it's a whole process, right? But what's the main goal of doing that? So let's take a look at the answer choices. First goal is to manage businesses and increase spending on all programs. And the second goal is to decide how to manage the government's tax revenue and expenditures. Third is finding a way to allow the economy to run on its own. And four is finding a way to slow down rapid economic growth. So first, let's go with the first answer choice. Managing businesses and increasing spending on all programs. That is not the goal of the federal budget, especially these days since we always run a deficit. We're trying as best we can to actually decrease spending where we can, right? And the question is really what are things that we're going to pay for or spend money on, given a limited amount of tax revenue, right? And so you can think of tax revenue as the income for the government. It's not going to be A, because we are definitely not increasing spending on all programs. And again, we're also not managing businesses. Federal expenditures are mostly spent on federal executive branch departments, and maybe primarily on I forgot what they're called, non-discretionary spending, which is stuff like Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. So that is stuff that is not business related. So it's not going to be one. Two says deciding how to manage the government's tax revenue and expenditures. This is pretty spot on. It's balanced. You can think of any business that you're running. You have your income and your expenditures. The same goes to the government. The government is collecting income from tax revenue, and it's deciding where is it going to spend its money, aka its expenditures. So that's probably going to be the best answer. But let's take a look at the other ones. The third answer choice is finding a way to allow the economy to run on its own. That is again not one of the goals of the federal budget. The economy largely is running on its own and just within the framework set by governments, and that is more an issue of policy rather than about budget. And four, finding a way to slow down economic growth. And then again, that might be the case in maybe saying let's modify fiscal policy this year, but again, that's not the main goal of the federal budget. The reason we do it every year is we want to know where we want to spend our discretionary spending every year. So let's take a look at the answer choice provided by the tutor. So they chose 2 as well, deciding how to manage the government's tax revenue and expenditures. And he said the federal budget consists of the revenues and expenditure description of the government of the United States and serves as a financial representation of the economic priorities of the government. The main goal behind creating a federal budget is to decide upon the management of tax revenue and allocate the same on various government expenditures such as Social Security, healthcare, defense, interest payments, non-defense discretionary spending, and etc. So yeah, those are some of the main categories of spending. The budget allows the government to analyze the effects of its economic policies and make relevant decisions regarding fiscal spending. I'm not entirely sure that the government is analyzing the effects of its economic policies through its budget. I'm sure there's a lot of analyzing that goes into creating the federal budget, but the actual purpose of creating the federal budget is not necessarily to. Maybe it is. So yeah, we'll give it that. And so yeah, so I'd say largely a good answer, good description. And so we're going to say that too. That's correct. So let's take a look at this next question. And it says, both excess supply and excess demand are a result of which one of the following? Equilibrium, disequilibrium, overproduction, or elasticity. So we can think about this graphically in our head. This is not a question you need to draw out, but if you do draw it out in your head, it'll make a lot more sense. So let's start with excess supply. So excess supply is going to be a situation. We have demand here, we have supply here, something like this. We have this, what we call a surplus, where supply is greater than demand. And we can see that that's because we're not trading at the equilibrium point here. Let's take a look at the other scenario, which is excess demand. That's going to be somewhere here. And so we have this area here, and that's going to be our shortage. And again, that's because we're not at this equilibrium point where supply and demand are equal. So the correct answer here is going to be disequilibrium. Anytime you have a deficit or shortage, it is because the economy is for some reason not operating at equilibrium. We know that one example of that happening here is if you had a government policy like a price floor that is set at this level, or a government setting a price ceiling at this level, that's going to cause either excess supply or excess demand, depending on which policy it is. And that disequilibrium is going to cause there to have that shortage or surplus, aka excess supply or excess demand. Take a look at the answer choice provided. This equilibrium, when a market deviates from its equilibrium, i.e. the point at which the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, a shortage or a surplus is created. When the market price is above the equilibrium price, quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, leading to excess supply in the market, i.e. a surplus. That is true. When the market price is below the equilibrium, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, leading to excess demand, i.e. a shortage. Yeah, great answer. Very great answer. Very succinct. And that's going to be correct. So let's take a look at another question that we might have. Why is the slow growth that can result from a contractionary policy a positive effect? It can decrease inflation, it can increase interest rate, it can decrease available credit, it can increase the money supply. So let's take a look at contractionary monetary policy. So this is something we talked about last time, but we have our short run aggregate supply and a long run aggregate supply. So long run aggregate supply. short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, you have your equilibrium. So we basically, when we have contractionary policy, are dealing with this is what is called a expansionary gap. And so the economy in the short run is producing at too high of a level relative to what the long-term aggregate supply should be. And so we want the economy to slow down because it's growing too fast. And one way we're going to do that is going to be, shrinking aggregate demand. And so we might have a shift in aggregate demand so that it intersects here. And that's going to cause us to have a new equilibrium point. What we can see here as a side effect, though, of doing that is we've reduced output. We've also reduced prices, right? Price used to be at P1, now it's at P2. There's a reduction in price. And that's one of the effects of contractionary fiscal policy or contractionary policy. And that effect is to decrease inflation, right? Because we see price levels are actually going from P1 to P2, and we're decreasing back to the long run aggregate supply curve. So that's going to be a decrease in inflation, and that's something that's going to happen when we're dealing with contractionary policy. Let's take a look at the answer choice provided by the previous tutor. So it says it can decrease inflation, correct? And it says a contractionary fiscal or monetary policy is adopted to control the effects of rising inflation in the economy by reducing the level of aggregate demand. It is adopted to prevent the economy from overheating. Exactly. When prices in the economy start to rise due to overwhelming aggregate demand to which the aggregate supply fails to cater, either the government of the economy adopts a contractionary fiscal policy involving a reduction in the level of government spending or an increase in the tax rate, or the monetary authority of the economy adopts a contractionary monetary policy involving a reduction in the money supply. Both actions ultimately decrease the level of aggregate demand by shrinking the spending capacity of consumers. Exactly. A reduction in aggregate demand shifts the curve to the left, which decreases the inflation rate in the market. Yeah, so again, probably if visualized, I think it's very easy to see. You can't visualize it when you're writing this answer choice, unfortunately. But I think this is a great answer, and it covers all the interactions that we're talking about here in terms of what we see happening with, expansionary fiscal gaps and why the types of solutions government can take to engage in contractionary policy, and finally the outcome, which is, among other things, a decrease in price. And so that's going to be that decrease in inflation rate. So great summary of contractionary policy.